I never thought I'd be the type of person to have problems with an HOA president. I've always kept to myself, paid my dues on time, and maintained my property to code. But when Karen Hendricks took over as president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, my quiet suburban life turned into a battlefield I never asked to enter. It started innocently enough. I work from home as a consultant for international clients, which means I keep odd hours. Sometimes I'm on video calls at 2 a.m., sometimes I'm up at dawn, and occasionally I'm working through the night when a project in Tokyo or London needs immediate attention. My home office is in my basement, which I soundproofed and converted into a professional workspace complete with multiple monitors, recording equipment, and proper lighting. The setup cost me about $60,000, but it was worth it for the flexibility and privacy it provided. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of HOA karma, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more tales of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Your support helps us keep bringing you these satisfying stories of justice served cold. Karen lived 3 houses down from me, in a meticulously maintained colonial with shutters she repainted every single year. She'd been on the HOA board for 5 years before running for president, and everyone knew she'd been waiting for old Mr. Peterson to retire so she could finally take control. Within her first week as president, she sent out a 12-page memo detailing new guidelines for everything from mailbox heights to the exact shade of beige allowed for exterior paint. I didn't think much of it at first. Every neighborhood has that one person who takes these things too seriously, right? But Karen wasn't just enthusiastic about rules. She was obsessed with control, and more specifically, with controlling what she didn't understand. The first complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning. A formal letter, printed on HOA letterhead, slipped into my mailbox. Dear resident, it has come to our attention that unusual activity has been observed at your residence during late night hours. Multiple lights have been seen turning on and off in your basement between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. This behavior is disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood and may constitute a violation of Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws regarding home-based businesses. Please respond within 10 business days with an explanation of these activities. I almost laughed. Unusual activity? I was working. I sent back a polite email explaining that I work from home as a consultant and sometimes keep irregular hours due to international time zones. I even included my business license number and a brief description of my consulting work in tech infrastructure. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, another letter. Dear resident, your previous response has been deemed insufficient. The HOA board requires a detailed schedule of your work hours, a list of all clients you conduct business with, and proof that your home office complies with all zoning regulations. Additionally, we will need to conduct an inspection of your basement workspace to ensure it meets HOA standards. Please schedule this inspection within 5 business days. Now, I should mention something about my background. Before I went into private consulting, I spent 15 years as a corporate lawyer specializing in property law and municipal regulations. I left that career because I was burned out on the politics and endless posturing, but I never lost my understanding of how these systems work. I knew exactly what the HOA could and couldn't demand, and this was way over the line. I sent back a response, professionally worded but firm. Dear Ms. Hendricks, I appreciate the HOA's concern for neighborhood standards. However, my home office is fully compliant with all local zoning laws and building codes, as verified by the city when I obtained my permits 3 years ago. The HOA bylaws do not grant authority to inspect the interior of members' homes without evidence of a specific violation affecting common areas or other properties. My work activities are contained entirely within my property and do not create noise, odor, or visual disturbances. I have attached copies of my business license, zoning approval, and building permits for your records. I consider this matter closed. Karen did not consider the matter closed. She started watching my house. I'd see her car parked at the end of the street in the evenings, just sitting there. She'd walk past my house 3 or 4 times a day, always slowing down to peer at my windows. She started attending every HOA meeting with a folder specifically labeled with my address, filled with what she called incident reports. October 15th, 11:42 p.m., basement lights observed. October 16th, 1:18 a.m., basement lights observed. October 17th, 3:05 a.m., subject observed taking trash to curb. Yes, she wrote an incident report because I took my trash out at 3 a.m. after finishing a project deadline. The harassment escalated over the next 2 months. I received citations for my grass being a quarter-inch too tall. A warning because my car was parked 2 inches over the edge of my driveway. A formal complaint because a delivery truck blocked the street for 8 minutes while dropping off new equipment. Each citation came with increasingly aggressive language and threats of fines. I tried reasoning with her one more time. I showed up at an HOA meeting, presented my case calmly, and explained that I was simply working from home in a way that didn't affect anyone. The other board members seemed uncomfortable, a few even nodded sympathetically, but Karen cut me off. "I don't care what you claim you're doing down there," she said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "No legitimate business operates at those hours. The constant lights, the odd schedules, the equipment deliveries at all hours, it's suspicious. For all we know, you could be running an illegal gambling operation, or manufacturing drugs, or hosting some kind of inappropriate online activities. This neighborhood has standards, and I will not allow your suspicious behavior to bring down our property values." The room went silent. Even her most loyal board members looked shocked. One of them, a retired teacher named Dorothy, actually spoke up. "Karen, that's quite an accusation. He's provided all his documentation. Maybe we should just—" "The meeting is adjourned," Karen snapped, and stormed out. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules or neighborhood standards. This was about Karen's pathological need to know and control everything in her domain, and my refusal to let her inspect my private workspace had become a personal affront she couldn't tolerate. The next week, I invested in a security camera system. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because Karen's behavior was getting erratic enough that I wanted documentation if things went further. High-definition cameras covering every angle of my property, with cloud backup and motion detection. The installer, a former police officer who now ran his own security company, looked at my setup and whistled. "Someone giving you trouble?" he asked. "HOA president," I said. "Say no more. I've installed systems for 3 other people on this street for the same reason." That installation turned out to be the best $1,200 I ever spent, because 2 nights later at 1:37 a.m., while I was on a video call with a client in Singapore, my phone lit up with a motion alert. I pulled up the camera feed on my second monitor, and there she was. Karen Hendricks, dressed in dark clothing, crossing my backyard with a flashlight, heading straight toward my basement windows. If you're loving this story and want to hear more tales of karma coming for entitled people, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Eat World and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. We've got plenty more where this came from. I watched in disbelief as she crouched down by one of my basement windows, cupping her hands around the flashlight to peer inside. My basement windows are high and small, ground level on the outside, and I keep privacy film on them for exactly this reason. She couldn't see anything, but that didn't stop her from trying. She moved from window to window, at one point actually trying to pull one open. Then she did something I couldn't quite believe even as I watched it happen. She took out her phone and started taking pictures. Pictures of my house, my windows, my property, all while trespassing in my backyard at nearly 2 in the morning. I stayed on my video call, but I minimized the window and pulled up my security footage on the full screen, recording everything. After about 15 minutes, Karen gave up and hurried back across my yard, looking around nervously as she went. The next morning, I had a decision to make. I could confront her directly, I could report her to the police, or I could wait and see what she'd do next. My instinct as a former lawyer told me to document everything and let her keep digging her own hole. I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, I received an emergency citation from the HOA, immediate violation notice. Resident is operating illegal nighttime activities in basement workspace. Photographic evidence has been obtained showing suspicious lighting patterns and possible storage of unapproved materials visible through windows. Resident must cease all basement activities immediately pending full investigation. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $250 and potential legal action from the HOA. She'd actually written up a citation based on evidence she'd obtained by trespassing on my property in the middle of the night. The audacity was almost impressive. I made copies of everything. The citation, the previous letters, the incident reports, and of course, the crystal clear security footage of Karen sneaking around my property at 1:30 in the morning. Then I paid a visit to an old colleague of mine who'd left the corporate world around the same time I did, but had gone into criminal defense instead of consulting. Rachel looked over my documentation with the kind of smile that usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She trespassed on your property to gather evidence for an HOA violation that doesn't actually exist, then issued a citation based on that illegally obtained evidence, she said, tapping the papers with her pen. And you have video proof of all of it. What are my options? I asked. Well, you could file a police report for trespassing and let the criminal justice system handle it. You could sue her personally for harassment. You could report her to the HOA board for misconduct. Or, she leaned back in her chair, you could do all three, and also file a restraining order based on her pattern of escalating behavior. I thought about it. Karen had made this personal. She'd accused me of criminal activity in front of my neighbors, harassed me for months, and now she'd actually broken the law to try to find something to use against me. The reasonable approaches hadn't worked. It was time for consequences that matched her actions. Let's do all of it, I said. And let's make sure it's airtight. The next morning, I went to the police station and filed a formal complaint for trespassing. I brought printed stills from my security footage showing Karen clearly identifiable with timestamps, along with copies of all her previous harassment. The officer who took my report recognized my address immediately. Willow Creek? Let me guess, HOA problems? He looked sympathetic. How'd you know? I asked. We get calls from that neighborhood all the time. Mostly civil disputes, but we've had a few incidents with the current HOA president. Between you and me, you're not the first person she's trespassed on, but you're the first one who's had video evidence. That was interesting. Other people? I asked. Can't give you details, but yeah. Lady has a history. Never anything we could make stick because it was all he said she said, but if you've got clear video, that's a different story. He took my statement, reviewed the footage, and told me an officer would be contacting Karen within 24 hours. He also mentioned, almost casually, that if I wanted to pursue a restraining order, this incident plus my documentation of her previous behavior would probably be enough. I filed for the restraining order that afternoon. Then I contacted the HOA board directly, bypassing Karen entirely. I sent a formal complaint to all 4 other board members with copies of everything: the security footage, her trespassing, her citation based on illegally obtained evidence, and a legal letter from Rachel explaining that the HOA could be held liable for Karen's actions if they continued to support her harassment campaign. Dorothy, the retired teacher, called me within an hour. Oh my God, she said, her voice shaking. I knew Karen was taking this too far, but I had no idea. She told us she'd driven past your house and seen suspicious activity, not that she'd climbed around your property in the middle of the night. The board is calling an emergency meeting tonight. I'm so sorry this happened. The emergency HOA meeting happened without Karen. They'd suspended her from all HOA activities pending an investigation, and Dorothy had taken over as interim president. But the real fireworks came 2 days later when the police showed up at Karen's door. I wasn't there to see it, but according to my neighbors, and trust me, everyone on the street was talking about it, 2 officers arrived at Karen's house at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning. They spent about 20 minutes inside, and when they came out, Karen was with them, not in handcuffs, but clearly being escorted to their patrol car for questioning. The police charged her with criminal trespassing. It's a misdemeanor in our state, But with the video evidence and my documentation of her pattern of behavior, the prosecutor decided to take it seriously. Karen was given a court date and released, but the damage to her reputation was immediate and catastrophic. She tried to fight back, of course. She sent an email to the entire neighborhood explaining that she'd only been trying to protect property values, that she'd had legitimate concerns about illegal activities, that she was the real victim of a vindictive resident who was trying to destroy the HOA. The email backfired spectacularly. 3 other residents came forward with their own stories of Karen's harassment. One had been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden Karen deemed unsightly. Another had been threatened with legal action for parking a work van in his own driveway. A third had been issued citations for her children's toys being briefly visible in the front yard. The HOA board was suddenly facing the possibility of multiple lawsuits, all centered around Karen's pattern of abuse of power. The restraining order was granted. Karen was legally prohibited from coming within 100 feet of me or my property, which was awkward since she lived 3 houses down. It meant she had to take a different route when leaving her neighborhood, couldn't attend HOA meetings if I was present, and couldn't send me any direct communications. But here's where my background in property law came into play, and where Karen's harassment was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. See, I'd been looking into the HOA bylaws very carefully over the past few months, and I discovered something interesting. The Willow Creek HOA, like many older suburban HOAs, had been established in the 1980s when the neighborhood was first developed. The bylaws had been amended over the years, but the original framework remained largely intact. And that framework included a provision that most people had forgotten about, a clause that allowed any homeowner to call for a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely if they could get signatures from 60% of the households. In a neighborhood of 85 homes, I needed 51 signatures. I spent the next 3 weeks going door to door, explaining what had happened, sharing my experience, and listening to others share theirs. I was careful, professional, and I made sure everyone understood this wasn't about revenge. This was about the fact that our HOA had become a vehicle for one person's need for control, and even with Karen removed, the structure that allowed her to abuse that power remained intact. People were receptive. More than receptive, actually. They were eager. Turns out Karen had been making enemies for years, and I was just the person who'd finally stood up to her with the resources and knowledge to fight back effectively. Within 2 weeks, I had 62 signatures. More than enough. The vote to dissolve the HOA was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving everyone time to review the implications. During that time, Karen was convicted of criminal trespassing. The judge gave her a suspended sentence, a fine, and probation, along with a stern lecture about respecting people's privacy and property rights. She showed up at her sentencing looking shaken, but she still had that defiant tilt to her chin, like she was the wrong party in all this. I wasn't at the sentencing, I didn't need to be, but several of my neighbors were, and they reported back that Karen had actually tried to argue to the judge that she'd been protecting the neighborhood. The judge wasn't impressed. But the real turning point, the moment when Karen finally understood the full scope of what was happening, came at the vote to dissolve the HOA. She couldn't attend because of the restraining order and her suspension from HOA activities, but she knew it was happening. The vote was held at the community center, and 73 of the 85 households sent representatives. Dorothy ran the meeting with efficiency and fairness, explaining the implications of dissolution, the fact that we'd still be bound by city ordinances and zoning laws, but that we'd be free from HOA oversight, fees, and restrictions. The vote wasn't even close. 68 households voted to dissolve. Only 5 voted to keep the HOA, and 3 of those were Karen's close friends who'd served on the board with her. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association officially ceased to exist 30 days after that vote. Karen's entire power base, the structure she'd spent years building influence in, the position she'd schemed and campaigned for, all of it was gone. Dissolved. And it was completely legal, done entirely through the proper channels using the HOA's own bylaws. But I wasn't done yet. You see, One of the things about dissolving an HOA is that all of its assets have to be distributed somehow. In our case, that meant the small community center building, the entrance monuments, and a reserve fund of about $80,000 that had been collected from dues over the years. The bylaws specified that in the event of dissolution, assets would be distributed proportionally to all homeowners based on their property values. Which meant every household was getting a check for about $940. Every household except one. Karen's house, it turned out, had several outstanding violations that she'd issued to herself over the years for minor infractions, part of her strategy to appear impartial. She'd never paid these fines, because as HOA president, she'd simply waived them for herself. But those unpaid fines were still technically on the books. And when the HOA dissolved, all outstanding debts had to be settled before final asset distribution. Karen's unpaid fines, which she'd accumulated and then waived for herself over 3 years, totaled just over $900. Which meant that while every other household in the neighborhood received a check, Karen received a bill. I had no hand in this, I want to be clear. I didn't manipulate the numbers or create the situation. This was entirely a consequence of Karen's own actions, her own violations she'd issued to herself, and her own decision to waive them instead of paying them like everyone else had to pay their fines. But the absolute best part, the moment I'd been waiting for, came 2 days after the dissolution was finalized. I was working in my basement, middle of the afternoon this time, when my doorbell rang. I checked my security camera and saw Karen standing on my front porch, holding a stack of papers. This was a violation of the restraining order, and I immediately called the police while keeping her on camera. But I also went to the door, staying inside with the door closed, and spoke to her through the video intercom system. "You need to leave," I said calmly. "You're violating the restraining order." Her face was blotchy with rage and tears. "You destroyed everything," she said, her voice breaking. "The HOA, my reputation, my standing in this community. You made me a criminal." "And for what?" "Because I tried to enforce basic standards. Because I wanted to know what you were really doing down there." "I'm working," I said. "Same thing I told you from the beginning." "And you destroyed yourself, Karen." "I just documented what you did and used the legal system exactly the way it's meant to be used. Every single action I took was completely legal and appropriate. Unlike you. You don't understand," she said desperately. "I spent years building influence in that HOA. I had plans, we were going to implement new standards, improve property values, make this the best neighborhood in the county. And you dissolved it. You took it all away. You had me arrested for taking out my trash at 3 a.m., I said. You trespassed on my property in the middle of the night because you couldn't handle not knowing every detail of my life. This isn't about property values or neighborhood standards. This is about your need for control, and it finally caught up with you." The police arrived before she could respond. I watched through my camera as she tried to explain to the officers that she just needed to talk to me, that I'd ruined her life and she deserved an explanation. They were professional but firm, explaining that she was in violation of a court order and needed to leave immediately. As they escorted her back toward her car, Karen turned and looked back at my house one more time. And I saw it, the exact moment when she understood the full scope of what had happened. She'd come after me with everything she had, citations and fines and accusations and harassment, all because she couldn't tolerate my private business activities that had nothing to do with her. And in response, I'd systematically documented her misconduct, gotten her criminally charged, removed her from power, and helped dissolve the entire organization she'd spent years trying to control. Her face went pale as she stood there, supported by the 2 police officers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. I could see it in her expression. She'd weaponized the HOA rules against me, and I'd used the HOA's own bylaws to eliminate it entirely. She'd trespassed to find evidence against me, and I'd used that trespassing to get her criminally charged. Every single move she'd made had been turned back against her with precise legal force. And the kicker, the thing that I could see dawning on her face as the officers guided her to their car, was that there was nothing she could do about it. It was all completely legal. All perfectly documented. all executed through proper channels. She'd spent months trying to find something illegal or improper in my activities and found nothing, while I'd simply documented her actually illegal and improper behavior and let the system work exactly as intended. The look on her face, that mixture of rage and despair and utter defeat, that moment when she finally understood that she'd been completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered by the very rules and systems she tried to weaponize, was absolutely perfect. If you enjoyed this story of epic HOA karma, please smash that like button and subscribe to Care and Eat World. We've got tons more stories about entitled people getting exactly what they deserve, and your support helps us keep bringing you this content. Drop a comment below telling us about your own HOA nightmares. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is just documenting everything and letting entitled people destroy themselves.